The Primus stove fed Roald Amundsen's team on the first successful journey to the South Pole in December 1911. A Primus stove boiled water for Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay at High Camp on Mount Everest the night before their summit in 1953. Fridtjof Nansen carried Primus stoves aboard the Fram during his 1893 Arctic trip, the first time any pressurized portable stove had gone on a polar expedition. The Svea 123, introduced in 1955, became the first compact, backpacking white gas stove ever made and went to the top of the world with more expeditions than any other single piece of cooking equipment in history. Every one of these stoves came from the same small cluster of Swedish workshops in the late 19th century, all of them built from the same material, solid brass, by men who had been making blowtorches and eventually asked themselves whether the same technology could make a pot of tea. Today, the Svea 123 is made in Taiwan. The Swedish workshops are gone. The brass machinists who built them to tolerances so precise that a stove purchased in 1960 still runs perfectly today are retired or dead. And the Optimus company that carried the Svea name through the 20th century is a brand inside a Swiss water filtration conglomerate that also makes Katadyn water filters and SteriPen UV purifiers. This is the full story of Svea and Optimus, from a factory mechanic in Stockholm who turned the blowtorch upside down in 1892 to the brass cylinder that cooked meals on every major expedition of the 20th century, to the self-pressurizing Svea 123 that defined ultralight backpacking for 50 years, to the Swedish manufacturing tradition that globalization quietly ended, and the collectors who now pay hundreds of dollars for a stove their fathers bought for $8.95. In the spring of 1892, a factory mechanic named Frans Wilhelm Lindqvist was working in Stockholm with a problem he could not solve. Lindqvist was 30 years old, born in the province of Västergötland in southwest Sweden, and employed at a manufacturing facility in the Swedish capital. He was not an inventor by training or by title. He was a factory mechanic, a man who understood how things worked and spent his days making them work better. The problem he was focused on was familiar to anyone who had ever tried to cook over an open flame. Kerosene lamps and conventional flame-fed cooking devices produce soot. The black carbon residue that accumulated on every pot, every pan, and every surface within range of an open kerosene flame was not merely unpleasant. In enclosed spaces, tents, cabins, ship's galleys, and expedition shelters, it coated everything in a thin black layer and posed a genuine health hazard through inhalation. Lindqvist's solution was elegant in the way that the best engineering solutions always are. He did not try to eliminate the soot by changing the fuel or modifying the flame. He eliminated it by changing the way the fuel was delivered to the flame. Instead of letting liquid kerosene wick upward toward an open flame, Lindqvist pressurized the fuel using compressed air, forcing it through a vaporizing tube where it converted from liquid to gas before combustion. Gasified kerosene burned cleaner, hotter, and more completely than liquid kerosene. The carbon particles that produce soot in conventional flame combustion were burned away in the higher temperature reaction of vaporized fuel. The flame was nearly smokeless. The soot problem was solved. His first prototype was completed in 1892. He and a business partner, a man named B.A. Hjorth, founded a company to manufacture it. They named the stove the Primus. The first model, called the number 1, was built entirely of brass. A squat cylindrical fuel tank at the base, a rising tube that carried the vaporized kerosene upward to the burner, a burner assembly that spread the flame evenly across the base of whatever pot sat above it on 3 supporting legs. The whole device weighed approximately 2.5 pounds and stood about 8 inches tall. It could boil a liter of water 7 times faster than an open wood fire. By 1893, Roald Amundsen was buying them. Not Amundsen specifically, not yet. The Norwegian explorer was 21 years old in 1893 and had not yet planned his polar expeditions. But Fridtjof Nansen was already preparing the Fram expedition, the audacious plan to allow a specially reinforced ship to become locked in Arctic pack ice and drift northward toward the pole over a period of years. Nansen's team needed cooking equipment that would work in temperatures no open flame could survive and in conditions where resupply was impossible. 2 Primus stoves went aboard the Fram when it departed Norway in June 1893. For 15 months, as the Fram drifted northward across the Arctic pack ice to a then record latitude of 86 degrees and 13 minutes north, the Primus stoves cooked the crew's meals and melted the ice that provided their drinking water. The Primus worked in temperatures that froze every other liquid on the ship, in conditions where a failure of the cooking apparatus was not an inconvenience but a survival crisis. It worked, and Nansen came back and told other explorers it worked, and the next generation of Arctic and Antarctic expeditions went south and north with Primus stoves in their equipment list as a matter of course. Roald Amundsen used Primus stoves on his transit of the Northwest Passage from 1903 to 1906, the first complete navigation of the sea route through the Canadian Arctic. He used them again on his South Pole expedition from 1910 to 1912, the journey that put 5 Norwegians on the bottom of the world on December 14, 1911, while Robert Falcon Scott's British team was still weeks away. Amundsen's meticulous planning, his attention to fuel calculations, his precise management of stove burn times, his insistence on equipment that would not fail in the Antarctic cold, was a significant factor in the expedition's success. The Primus was the cooking apparatus he trusted. In his 1912 memoir, he credited the stove's reliability as one of the reasons his team survived and Scott's did not. Meanwhile, in Sundbyberg, a small industrial city just northwest of Stockholm, a different man was building a different stove. Carl Richard Nyberg was born in 1858 and was, by the 1880s, one of the most productive inventors in Sweden. He was particularly interested in pressurized combustion, blowtorches, lamps, heating devices, and had founded a company called C.R. Nyberg's Lodlamfabrik to manufacture them. Lodlamfabrik means blowtorch factory. Nyberg built blowtorches, but he also built stoves based on similar pressurized combustion principles, and he eventually produced a design under the name Svea, the ancient poetic name for Sweden itself. The first Svea kerosene cookers were primitive by later standards, but they established the brand name and the manufacturing base in Sundbyberg that would, 60 years later, produce the most famous camping stove in history. Nyberg was not just a stove builder, he was an aviation pioneer, one of the first men in Scandinavia to build and test powered aircraft. Working from a small airfield outside his home in Lidingö in the years before and after the Wright brothers' 1903 flights, he called his aircraft Flugan, the fly. He was a man of restless mechanical curiosity who moved between projects with the same energy that made him one of the largest industrial employers in Sundbyberg. The Svea stoves were one thread in a life built from many. In 1922, the Nyberg company was taken over by Max Sievert, an early associate of Nyberg's, who had worked with him for years and understood the manufacturing operation well. Sievert renamed the company Sieverts Lodlamfabrik and continued producing Svea stoves alongside the blowtorch line. Under Sievert's management, the Svea brand developed steadily through the 1920s and the 1930s, refining the burner design, improving the fuel delivery system, expanding the product range to include stoves for different applications and fuel types. Across town, in Stockholm, a separate company had been building its own line of outdoor stoves since 1899. Aktiebolaget Optimus, Optimus Inc., was founded in Stockholm by entrepreneurs who recognized the market for portable pressurized stoves that Lindqvist's Primus had created and wanted a piece of it. Optimus produced its own brass stove designs under the Optimus name, targeting the same expeditionary and outdoor market that Primus and Svea were serving. The 3 Swedish stove companies, Primus, Svea, and Optimus, competed in the same small specialized market for most of the early 20th century, each building variations on the same fundamental technology: pressurized fuel, brass construction, vaporizing burner. In 1962, Optimus acquired the rights to the Primus, named for liquid-fueled stoves. The consolidation of Swedish stove manufacturing had begun. The Second World War had tested all of them. Military field stoves, Cooking equipment for soldiers in conditions ranging from the North African desert to the Norwegian mountains to the Pacific Islands were produced by all three Swedish manufacturers. The pressurized brass stove, already proven in the most extreme conditions on Earth by 4 decades of polar and mountaineering expeditions, was exactly what a military logistics officer wanted. Simple, with no moving parts that could break in the field, repairable by any soldier with basic mechanical ability, capable of burning reliably in wind and cold where conventional cooking equipment could not function. The Germans built their own version, the Joel 33 and 34 field stoves, made by Gustav Bartel of Dresden, were nearly identical in size, weight, and operation to the Svea designs. The technology was so fundamentally sound that both sides of the war converged on the same solution independently. Swedish-made stoves equipped Allied forces in multiple theaters. They came back from the war carried by a generation of soldiers who had cooked on them in conditions that tested them beyond any civilian camping trip, in soaking rain, in frozen mud, at altitude under fire, and who trusted them with the particular conviction of men who had learned in the most serious possible context that a piece of equipment either worked or it didn't. The Svea and Optimus stoves worked. In 1953, a Primus stove cooked the last meal Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay ate before their summit of Mount Everest. At Camp 9, at 27,900 feet, higher than any human being had ever slept before that night, they boiled water on a Primus to make soup and sardines and biscuits and sweet lemon water. The next morning, May 29, 1953, they climbed to the top of the world. The stove that had kept them fed was a descendant of the design Frans Wilhelm Lindqvist had built in his Stockholm workshop 61 years earlier. Then, in 1955, Siebert AB introduced the Svea 123. It was, in retrospect, the most important camping stove ever made. Not the most technically complex, not the most powerful, not even the most efficient by the standards of later designs, but the most important because the Svea 123 was the first stove built specifically for the backpacker rather than the expedition. Every previous pressurized brass stove had been designed for expedition use, for teams of climbers or polar travelers who could distribute the weight of cooking equipment across multiple people. The Svea 123 was designed for one person. It weighed 500 grams, about 18 ounces. It stood 100 millimeters wide and 130 millimeters tall. The fuel tank, integrated into the body of the stove, held approximately 120 milliliters of white gas, enough to boil a liter of water in 7 minutes and burn for nearly an hour at full output. The aluminum lid that sealed the stove for transport doubled it as a small cook pot. The brass windscreen attached directly to the body folded to provide pot supports when the stove was in use. The whole unit packed to the size of a coffee can. The Svea 123 operated on a principle of elegant self-sufficiency that still defines the stove's character today. To start it, you filled the small depression at the top of the burner assembly with a few drops of fuel and lit them. The flame heated the fuel tank. As the tank warmed, the white gas inside vaporized. The pressure built. You opened the valve. The vaporized fuel shot up through the vaporizer tube and into the burner, where it combusted in a roaring blue flame that climbers compared accurately to the sound of a jet engine at takeoff. The process required no pump, no external pressure source, no battery, no electronic ignition. A piece of brass tubing, a valve, and a small fire. The roar of a Svea 123 starting up, the small fireball of the primer fuel, then the building hiss as pressure accumulated, then the sudden thunder of the full flame became one of the defining sounds of American backpacking in the 1960s and the 1970s. Every hiker who carried one knew the sequence. Every hiker who heard it from a neighboring campsite knew exactly what it meant. Somebody was making dinner. In 1969, Optimus acquired Siebert AB and the Svea brand. Swedish stove manufacturing had consolidated down to two major names, Optimus and Primus, and Optimus now owned both the Optimus line and the Svea 123. The company introduced the 123R, the R standing for the self-cleaning needle now built into the burner assembly, a small internal pin that cleared the fuel jet by pushing accumulated debris outward when the control valve was turned fully counterclockwise. The 123R eliminated the need for the small external wire pricker that had come with the original 123 models, removing the most common source of field maintenance frustration. No moving parts to lose, no separate tools to carry. The stove that explorers had carried to the South Pole and the summit of Everest was now available in every outfitter and mountaineering shop in America for $8.95. Colin Fletcher, the Welsh-American hiker who became the first person to walk the length of the Grand Canyon and who wrote The Complete Walker, the defining manual of American backpacking philosophy, recommended the SVEA 123 in his 1968 edition. For a generation of American backpackers who learned their gear list from Fletcher's book, the Svea 123 was the camping stove, not one of several options. The stove. By the mid-1970s, the Svea 123 was the most widely carried backpacking stove in North America. The roar of its burner echoed across campsites in the Sierra Nevada, the Cascades, the Rockies, the Appalachians, and on trails in Europe, New Zealand, and Nepal. Guides on Everest approaches used it. Through hikers on the Pacific Crest Trail used it. Weekend campers who drove to a trailhead in a Volkswagen and spent 2 nights in the wilderness used it. The stove's dominance was so complete that for many hikers, Svea and camp stove were interchangeable terms, a brand name that had become a noun. Then, in 1971, 2 engineers at Mountain Safety Research in Seattle built a stove that would, over the next 2 decades, slowly displace the Svea from its position as the default American backpacking stove. Mountain Safety Research, MSR, was founded by Larry Pemberthy, a Boeing engineer who applied aerospace engineering principles to climbing equipment. The MSR stove that arrived in the early 1970s used a remote fuel bottle connected to the burner by a flexible hose. The fuel bottle could be refilled from any white gas container. The flame output could be adjusted more precisely than the Svea's valve allowed. In conditions where the Svea's self-pressurizing system struggled, in very cold temperatures where the fuel tank couldn't generate enough heat to build pressure and the stove would sputter and fail, the MSR pump pressurized system maintained consistent output. More critically, MSR was an American company competing directly in the American market, and the outdoor retail expansion of the 1970s and 1980s favored brands that could respond quickly to American retail channels and American consumer preferences. The MSR WhisperLite, introduced in 1984, was lighter than the Svea, quieter than the Svea, capable of simmering in ways the Svea's roaring output made difficult, and sold through the same REI and Eastern Mountain Sports channels where the Svea had dominated. The Svea was not displaced overnight. It was displaced gradually, over a decade, as the backpacking market shifted toward lighter gear, as the MSR WhisperLite earned a reputation as reliable as the Svea's own, and as canister stoves, pressurized gas cartridges with integrated burners that required no priming, no fire on the tank, and no understanding of vaporizer tubes or fuel valves, offered new hikers a starting experience that was dramatically simpler than the Svea's theatrical ignition ritual. The canister stove's appeal to the new generation of backpackers was real and rational. You screwed the burner onto the cartridge, turned the valve, and lit it with a spark lighter. There was no premier fuel to measure, no waiting for the tank to pressurize, no small fireball to manage. The Svea's ignition sequence, the calculated drops of fuel, the cupped hands around the premier pan, the controlled flame, the building hiss, the moment of decision about when to open the main valve, was not a flaw. It was, to anyone who had mastered it, a pleasure, a ritual with a logic and a satisfaction built into its steps. But mastery required practice, and practice required commitment, and the new generation of backpackers arriving at outfitters in the 1980s and 1990s had been raised on convenience appliances that started instantly. The Svea 123 was a stove for people who had chosen to understand it. That was a smaller market than it had once been. It was a classic, a beloved, proven, cold status piece of equipment that serious backpackers knew and respected, and in many cases continued to carry, but it was no longer what the outfitter recommended to the first-time hiker coming through the door. Optimus continued to develop its stove line through this period, producing multi-fuel stoves capable of burning white gas, kerosene, diesel, unleaded gasoline, and aviation fuel, the kind of fuel flexibility that expedition teams working in remote areas valued because it removed dependence on a specific fuel type. The Optimus 111B, the Nova, the Polaris, each represented genuine engineering advancement, but the market for multi-fuel expedition stoves was smaller than the mass backpacking market that canister stoves and MSR had captured. And Optimus's Swedish manufacturing costs made price competition with the new generation of Asian-made stoves structurally difficult. In 2007, Optimus was acquired by the Katadyn Group, a Swiss outdoor company primarily known for water filtration products under the Katadyn and Steripen brands. The acquisition moved Optimus from independent Swedish ownership into a diversified outdoor products portfolio. The Katadyn Group is itself owned by Claros Corporation, the Utah-based outdoor holding company that also owns Black Diamond equipment. The Svea 123R is still in production today under the Optimus name sold by the Katadyn Group. It is made in Taiwan. The price is approximately $100, more than 10 times what it cost in 1968, in dollars that are themselves worth far less than $1968. Collectors and longtime users note, with the precision of people who have disassembled dozens of the stoves over years of use, that the machining tolerances on Taiwanese-made units are not quite what they were on Swedish-made units. The brass finish is slightly different. The spindle operates slightly differently. The stove works. It is not quite the same stove. The Swedish manufacturing tradition that produced it, the precision brass workshops of Stockholm and Sundbyberg, the craftsmen who machined fuel valves and vaporizer tubes to tolerances close enough that a stove built in 1960 would still operate perfectly in 2025, is gone. Trangia, the Swedish maker of alcohol stoves, is the only remaining Swedish camp stove manufacturer still producing in Sweden. Pre-1969, Svea 123 stoves, the ones made by Siebert AB before the Optimus acquisition, are traded on collector forums and outdoor gear marketplaces at prices ranging from $80 to $300 depending on condition, stoves that cost $8.95 new. A user on Classic Camp Stoves, a collector forum dedicated to vintage outdoor cooking equipment, wrote in 2019, "I've been using my 1963 Svea 123 for 56 years. I have never done anything to it except clean the jet and replace the filler cap gasket once. It will outlast me." He is almost certainly right. The brass cylinder that boiled water on the ice shelf at 86 degrees north in 1893, that melted snow in the South Pole tent in 1911, that cooked a sardine supper at 27,900 feet on Everest in May 1953. His descendants still sit in the pack pockets of backpackers on every mountain range on Earth. They roar when they light. They smell of white gas and hot brass. They sound like a small jet engine taking off from the palm of your hand. The factories that made them in Sweden are silent. The stoves are not.